Okay. So, hello everyone. Nice meeting you, and it's nice to see so many, faces pop up, and also welcome new faces. So, thank you for coming for today. Today we'll have one of our Getty lecture by Professor Tessa Moli Suzuki. So I'm just gonna do a very brief introduction, although I know many of you have already known or read her book and also publications. Yes, you so and then Magdalena is holding a Japanese translation of it. As far as I know, she's making her students reading it. And so today we are very happy to have Professor Tessa with us, and she's a emeritus professor at Australian National University. And as many of you know, she's a leading historian of Japan. She has done extensive research on the politics and history of modern Japan and East Asia, exploring issues of migration, citizenship, historical memory, borders, and national identity. Her research interests include the past and the present of the indigenous people of the Russo-Japanese border area. And by the way, I'm just shamelessly copying one from her website, and the grassroots movements and the survival politics in Northeast Asia, the Korean War in regional context, border controls and migration in East Asia, national identity and ethnic minorities in Japan, modern Japanese historiography, human rights in Asia, globalization process, memory and reconciliation in Northeast Asia. And she has published extensively in both Japanese and English on these topics. Some of her recent books include On the Frontiers of History, Rethinking East Asian Borders, published in 2020, and Japan's Living Politics, published in 2022, and The Living Politics of Self-Help Movements in East Asia, co-edited with Tom Cliff and Shuge Wei. And also New Words from Below, published in 2017, co-edited with Yung Jong-so. I'm sorry for my butchering of the Korean names. And also East Asia Beyond the History Wars in 2013, co-author with Morris Lowe and Leonid Petrov and Timothy Tsu. And also Borderline Japan in 2010, To the Diamond Mountains in 2010, and Exodus to North Korea in 2007, and also The Past Within Us, Media, Memory, and History in 2005, and which we signed to our students and we share our ratings. And also Professor Tessa co-edited the 8-volume history of the Asia-Pacific War, published in Japanese by Iwanami Publishers in 2005 to 2006, and also the multi-volume work, Hitobito no Seishinshi, History of Popular Ideas and Emotions in Post-War Japan, published by Iwanami in 2015 and 2016. So she, among a lot of distinguished awards she received, and I want to mention this, she also received our Fukuoka Prize, Fukuoka show in 2013. So please join me in welcome Professor Tessa. And Professor Tessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen before I start. I hope that's working okay. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with the audio, so the sound that's coming in is breaking up a little bit. So if you ask a question or something and I don't answer, I'm not ignoring you. It's just that I'm struggling a little with the sound, and we can always put some things in chat otherwise if we need to. I hope that you'll be able to hear me fine. So thank you so much, Gloria, for the introduction. And it's a real pleasure to take part in this series. I think the project, Shared Coasts and Divided Historiographies, looks fascinating. And it seems so important, at the moment we're in a time of rising political tensions in East Asia and around the world, really. So it's unite, bring countries together rather than divide them. I'm going to start off just briefly by talking about a political moment in the region before going on to talk mainly about cultural connections between various parts of East Asia. So I'll start off with this perfect moment of political theatre, I think it was, in April 2018. So this is the moment when Kim Jong-Un became the first North Korean leader to cross the line that divides North and South Korea. The crossing was achieved by one simple step across a very thin strip of concrete that marks the dividing line. And it highlights how strange and arbitrary this dividing line is. No sooner had Kim Jong-un taken this historic step across the border than another apparently unscripted part of the drama unfolded. So South Korean leader Moon Jae-in was waiting to greet him on the other side of the line, and Moon Jae-in apologized for the fact that he had not yet been able to go to the north, whereupon Kim Jong-un said, "You can do it right now." And the two leaders stepped hand in hand across the border into the northern side before crossing hand in hand back to the south. The leaders of North and South Korea then sat down for a meeting in a conference room on the 38th parallel, the dividing line, in front of a massive 6-meter wide painting of Mount Kŭmgang, known in English as the Diamond Mountains, the spectacularly rugged mountain range, which lies just north of the dividing line. This painting by South Korean artist Shin Jang-sik had been specially hung in the room for the occasion, and I hope the reason for that will become clear in the course of this talk. The ongoing drama of reconciliation continued through 2018 and 2019. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump met in Singapore for the first ever meeting between North Korean and US heads of state. Then in March 2019, Trump and Kim Jong-un had another brief meeting in Hanoi. And in June of the same year, they had a third short encounter in Korea. While all these remarkable diplomatic events were starting to unfold, New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art was staging an exhibition of works dedicated to Mount Kŭmgang, a place which the museum described as perhaps the most famous and emotionally resonant site on the Korean peninsula. Entitled Diamond Mountains, Travel and Nostalgia in Korean Art, the exhibition brought together a collection of superb images, paintings from famous Korean artists, including Jong-sun, who I will talk about a bit more later, all interpretations of Mount Kŭmgang's scenery. And what I want to do in the talk is to use the long-term history of this remarkable place, Mount Kŭmgang, the Diamond Mountains, to provide a sort of deep time perspective on the changing relationships between the countries and the societies of East Asia, particularly between Korea, Japan, and China, but also including connections to the wider world. So like other dramatic stretches of scenery, the Kŭmgang Range seems to command our attention and evoke emotion just by the force of its physical structure, its appearance, these amazing weathered rocks, which sometimes look as if they're in the shapes of human forms or animals. The rock formations extend to the seashore, making Mount Kŭmgang a place of flowing waters as well as a place of soaring peaks. But as the historian Simon Sharma has pointed out, landscape is a work of the mind. Its scenery is built up as much from strata of memory as from layers of rock. So what interests me particularly about this place is that it's been a point of intersection of many cultures, many cultural movements. And so it's been seen and interpreted and remembered in a multitude of different ways. In some of the things that I've written in the last, well, several years, I suppose, I've argued that when we try to think of an area in area studies, as in, East Asia or Southeast Asia or the Asia Pacific, it's maybe better not to think of it as a fixed geographical category with clear boundaries around it, but rather to think of it as a sort of fluid entity that is created and recreated by human processes like travel and trade and communication. So I talk about liquid area studies. In other words, rather than being embedded in geography, an area could be thought of as being a bit like a fountain or even the flow of a river, perhaps, where it's given shape by constant movement. And when the movement changes, the shape changes. So you can think of an area then as being created by human movement. And you can think of maybe two sorts of flows of human movement. So flows of people, goods, and ideas link social groups together. And that could be, migrations, it could be trade, it could be pilgrimage or whatever. So on the one hand, you have these cultural and physical flows, but then you also have what could be called vortices, a vortex being like a whirlpool, a place where the flows come together and all sorts of cultures interact. And those could be a city, or it could be a trading post, or it could be a point of pilgrimage. And I think that over the centuries, Mount Kŭmgang became a sort of cultural vortex where people from all sorts of different cultural directions came together in ever-changing ways. And that makes it a very interesting point to choose if you want to look at the area as a whole and see how the flows of connection to different parts of the world have changed. So to go a long way back in history, before Buddhism came to East Asia, high mountain peaks had been seen as the places where humans and the superhuman world came together. So in China, for example, the 5 great mountains of Taoism were revered as kind of cosmic pillars where humans and the sacred interacted. And in Korea, the figure of the mountain spirit, the Sanshin, was central to shamanic practices. In the legends of Mount Kŭmgang, though, the image that appears most often is not the Sanshin, who is often a male form, but rather the Sonyo, the ethereal female beings who are seen as inhabiting the high peaks of mountains and occupying the borderlands between the human and the divine. What you can see on your screen here, I think is quite interesting. This is a North Korean coin from the 1980s, and it depicts one of these sacred beings, a Sonyo. The word is sometimes translated as fairy, which I think doesn't quite capture it, because fairies in the Western tradition tend to be a bit more sort of cute and less sublime. Sonyo a little more spiritual and sublime. But anyway, this is a North Korean representation of a Sonyo. As Buddhism made inroads into China and then into Korea and on into Japan, local sacred mountains came to be reinterpreted in terms of the Buddhist scriptures. So the name Mount Kŭmgang actually comes from the Buddhist sutras. It means something like golden and unyielding. And it was a name that was given to sacred mountains in the mythology of Buddhism, things like the Flower Adornment Sutra. But this name was then transferred to the real mountains on the east coast of Korea. The inaccessible ravines and the mountaintops of Mount Kŭmgang offered a wonderful place for monastic retreat. And so Buddhist temples and monasteries began to be built in the valleys of Mount Kŭmgang, right from the beginning of Buddhism in Korea, really, from the middle of the 6th century of the Common Era, when the first Korean king to adopt Buddhism was on the throne. And then in the 6th and 7th centuries, there was a kind of golden age of temple construction, and a whole range of beautiful Buddhist temples were built in Mount Kŭmgang. The earliest literary references to the mountains come from Chinese classics. And the history of the temples is a reminder of the astonishingly long routes of Buddhist pilgrimage, which linked Korea not just to China, but also to India and to Central Asia. And this is, linked also to the Silk Route. It's something, incidentally, that the British historian William Dalrymple has recently written a book about, called The Golden Road, these enormously long routes of Buddhist pilgrimage, which linked various parts of Asia. So, for example, in the middle of the 20th century, the temple of Yujomsa in the Diamond Mountains in Mount Kŭmgang contained statues of the Buddha, which had arrived there about 1,000 years earlier from Tokharistan, which was a Buddhist kingdom on the borders of what is today Uzbekistan in Central Asia. Religious ideas were brought to Mount Kŭmgang by monks like Dhyanabhadra, who was a key figure in the emergence of Zen Buddhism or Son Buddhism, and who traveled from India to Mount Kŭmgang in the 14th century of the Common Era, an enormous journey by foot and horse and so on. When you come into a slightly more recent period, into the Joseon dynasty, the period from the last decade of the 14th century to the last decade of the 19th century, things change rather dramatically. So these very long journeys are kind of curtailed by political events in East Asia. Pilgrimages to Mount Kŭmgang continue, but in a different form. The things that caused the changes were disruptions brought about by the invasion of Korea by Japanese forces under the ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the last decade of the 16th century. The Manchu invasions of the Korean peninsula in the 1620s and 1630s, the establishment of the Manchu Qing dynasty in China, and so on. So connections between Korea and the outside world didn't cease, but they became less intense. Long journeys became more difficult. So the practice of pilgrimage then contracted geographically. The pilgrims tended to be now from within Korea or sometimes from China. And they also became more secular because during the Joseon dynasty, the rulers generally, most of them, were not particularly favorable to Buddhism. And what you get instead are sort of secular pilgrimages of artists and writers who are coming to absorb this extraordinary landscape and record their reactions to it. And in particular, you get the emergence of a wonderful new school of Korean landscape art, which flourished particularly from the 17th century onwards, and which included many depictions of Mount Kŭmgang. And the most famous exponent of this school was the person I mentioned earlier, Cheongson, who lived from the 1670s to the 1750s. A wonderful landscape painter, obviously inspired by Chinese landscape painting traditions. But Cheongson was kind of a bit of a bit revolutionary in the sense that he didn't just paint sort of idealized landscapes following Chinese tradition. He went and looked at the landscapes he painted from life, and he pioneered what came to be known as the True View landscape painting school. And a journey through Mount Kŭmgang was a critical turning point in the development of his artistic vision. It's very interesting art. So you can see in this picture, so there's a detail on the left and the larger scale picture on the right. incredibly detailed. If you zoom in, you can see all these little temples and hermitages tucked away in the valleys of the mountains. But although this was actually painted from life, he did go and sit in the mountains to paint. It isn't a literal depiction of the mountains, because the picture on the right, for example, is a view that you can't actually ever see in real life. It's a sort of almost an aerial view, a composite view of the mountains, as they would be seen almost from a sort of God's point of view. But what's happening here is the emergence of a new, more national Korean sense of art, and a Korean art that distinguishes itself from Chinese art. And the work of artists like Jong-un helped to stimulate this new form of secular pilgrimage to Mount Kŭmgang. Most of the visitors who came now were members of the Joseon era Korean elite, so officials and so on. And it became almost a rite of passage for young men, it was almost entirely men, to visit the mountains and go to certain famous points within Mount Kŭmgang. I think of it as being a little bit like the Grand Tour in Britain at the same time. So young aristocratic or wealthy men in Britain in the 18th and early 19th century were expected to go off to Italy and Greece and places for their education. Young Korean elite men were expected to go to Mount Kŭmgang. And interestingly, one of the things they did when they got there was often to engrave their names or the name of their ancestors or bits of poetry into the rocks of the mountains. A tradition that survives to the present day in a slightly altered form. So what you can see here is an older engraving on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, an engraving of a quotation from the thoughts of Kim Il-sung. So ideological slogans get carved into the rocks these days. As I mentioned, most of these visitors, almost all of these visitors, were men, but there were a few exceptions. One of them was a remarkable woman called Kim Jong-Un, who was born in 1817 and later became a concubine of a high-ranking courtier. But when she was 14, she decided that she was going to go on a visit to Mount Kŭmgang, so she dressed up as a boy and off she went and wrote a very vivid account of her journey. But then when you get into the 19th century, the late 19th century particularly, the whole nature of these flows of people to and from the mountains changes drastically, reflecting the changing political and social situation in East Asia. You get the forcible opening of Korea, the Japanese annexation of the peninsula. Well, first, competition between Japan and China and Russia for control over Korea, and then Japanese annexation in practice really from about 1905, although it was officially completed in 1910. And a completely new geography in which Mount Kŭmgang plays an interesting role, which I'll talk about. So the new geography is centered around the railway. This was, a key part of the colonial project. The building of railways had been started under the Joseon dynasty by Korean engineers, but it was completed by the Japanese colonizers. And they built railways that ran through the peninsula and linked Korea to the South Manchuria Railway, which ran through northeastern China and was, of course, controlled by Japan. And then that in turn linked to the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was completed just before the First World War. And these new networks brought a whole new flow of visitors, many of them Japanese, of course, but not only Japanese, people from further afield as well, as I'll explain in a moment. And they brought with them their own perceptions of this particular landscape monument in Korea. So Mount Kŭmgang became the site of colonial tourism. And it was not coincidental, it was not an accidental influx of tourism into Mount Kŭmgang. It was very much part of a deliberate Japanese policy of promoting tourism. I think the Japanese authorities were remarkably early in realizing the potential of tourism, not just to earn money, but also to educate and to spread propaganda. So they encouraged tourism to certain sites within Korea, both by Japanese and by foreigners. And part of the aim was to educate and also to propagate the message that, Japan was modernizing and improving Korea. And Mount Kongo, as they called it, Mount Kŭmgang, Kongo is the Japanese pronunciation of the same characters, was central to this project. It's quite interesting to contrast Kŭmgang with the other great sacred mountain in Korea, Mount Paektu, which is on the Korea-China border. Tourism to Mount Paektu was not greatly encouraged in the colonial period. I think mainly because this was an area where there was quite a lot of anti-colonial guerrilla activity going on through most of the colonial period. But Mount Kŭmgang was further south, it was in a more secure place, and it was more accessible, particularly after the construction of an electric railway, which went to the mountains to take tourists there. Before the opening of this railway, which occurred in 1924, the journey to the mountains had still been quite difficult, and visitors had to stay in private houses or in temples, which often offered lodging to outsiders. But by the late 1920s, the Japanese government and the colonial railway company and so on were building new hotels. They were putting out advertisements and tourist brochures in English as well as in Japanese. Interestingly, the hotels tended to be sort of Swiss-style chalets like this one. Mount Kŭmgang was being advertised as the future vacation land of the Far East. And more than 15,000 visitors traveled to Mount Kŭmgang in 1935. This wave of colonial secular pilgrims didn't displace Korean travelers. So of course, Korean travelers also came on the electric railway. And a number of writers and artists, Korean writers and artists, also visited the mountains in this period, leaving fiction and non-fiction records, which often, I think, express a sense of sort of pride and sorrow. So pride in the history of the mountains and the culture that surrounded them, but also a sense of sadness at the evidence of Japanese domination and the signs of decay of the monasteries and so on in the mountains, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. So the Japanese empire redrew the boundaries of space, both physical and mental boundaries, and created new perspectives on the mountains. So many Japanese artists and intellectuals traveled to Mount Kŭmgang in this period. And when you look at their writings and their art, you can see how their mental boundaries of the space to which they belonged had been expanded. And they were now seeing the colonies, the empire, as part of their space. For example, the Japanese writer Omachi Keigetsu, who visited Mount Kŭmgang in 1918, wrote, "The days have now passed when it was said that one could not speak adequately of landscape with those who have never climbed Mount Fuji. More recently, it was said that one could not speak adequately of landscape with those who have never climbed the Japan Alps. But nowadays, they say, one cannot speak adequately of landscape with those who have never climbed Mount Kongo." That's Mount Kŭmgang. So you can see how it's being incorporated into the Japanese imagination. Japanese artists like the watercolor landscape painter Maruyama Banka and the painter and printmaker Ishii Hakute hiked through Mount Kŭmgang, staying in these newly established Japanese hotels and painting the world around them. Famous writers like Tokutomi Soho in the early 20th century composed poetry about Mount Kŭmgang. Maruyama Banka produced this bird's eye view of the mountains, which was actually used by the colonial government in its tourism promotion campaign, excuse me. And it's quite interesting to compare this with Chong-sun's painting. You know, it's a similar sort of semi-aerial view of the mountains. And it's also very detailed. But Maruyama doesn't focus so much on the temples. He focuses more on the little hotels and so on that are popping up in the mountains. And whereas Chong-sun, in his landscape paintings of Mount Kŭmgang, was always looking at the mountains from the southwest, from the angle of somebody approaching the mountains from the Korean capital, Hanyang or Seoul. Whereas Maruyama Banka, as you might imagine, is looking from the east, from the perspective of arriving from the perspective of Japan. The impact of colonial modernity on the mountain landscape was far-reaching. So, for example, if we think about the Buddhist monasteries, there were about 40 or 50 Buddhist monasteries in the mountains at the beginning of the colonial era, but that declined. It was down to about 32 in the early 1930s. There were still some monks and some nuns in the mountains, but interestingly, they also became part of Japan's assimilation project. So some of the monks from Mount Kŭmgang were sent to Japan, particularly to Kyoto, to study Japanese Buddhism, which was regarded as being kind of more modernized than Korean Buddhism. The colonial government even had a plan, although this was actually never fulfilled, to proclaim Mount Kŭmgang as a national park under Japan's national park law. So they introduced a national park law in 1931, and the Seto Inland Sea and Mount Unzen and the Fuji Hakone district were all proclaimed national parks. And they were going to include Mount Kŭmgang, but then what with war and so on, that never actually happened. The central place of the Diamond Mountains in the Japanese visions of its Korean colony was really emphasized, I think, by the author and publisher Kikuchi Kan. So Kikuchi in the late 1930s established a rather interesting Korean Arts Prize. What he wanted to do was he wanted to make Korean literature and art better known and more accessible to a Japanese audience, because he thought the Japanese people didn't know enough about their Korean colony. The literature, of course, would be Korean literature written in Japanese. So it was promoting Korean culture, but at the same time, it was sort of part of the state policy of uniting Japan and Korea, assimilating Korea into Japan, what was called making Japan and Korea one body. And Kikuchi explained the purpose of his Korean Arts Prize by saying that it aimed to overcome the ignorance of Japanese people whose knowledge of Korea was generally limited to Mount Kŭmgang and Kŭmgang, Kŭmgang being Korean geisha. So he was saying really that, you know, just as ignorant Westerners know nothing about Japan apart from Mount Fuji and geisha, ignorant Japanese know nothing about Korea apart from Mount Kŭmgang and Kŭmgang. But meanwhile, it wasn't just Japanese who were arriving in the mountains as a result of Japanese colonization and the infrastructure that it created. Mount Kŭmgang became a highlight of the sort of standard Eastern tour conducted by Europeans and Americans. And it fitted, you know, the image of the Orient as a sort of exotic place, of extraordinary landscape, ancient temples, and so on. And this is particularly reflected in the work of some interesting printmakers, Western printmakers, who studied woodblock printing, particularly in Japan in the pre-war era. There were a number of Westerners who went to Japan to study woodblock printing. And one of the things that's interesting about them is that, you know, this is a period when leading Japanese artists, print artists, are tending to move away from the very traditional forms of woodblock printing and doing more kind of creative, modernized, what were called sosaku hanga, creative woodblock prints. But the Westerners tended to want to preserve the tradition, the traditional forms of woodblock printing. Amongst these artists, there were three particularly interesting women. Bertha Lum, who came from the United States and was active in the late 19th century to early 20th century. Elizabeth Keith, who came from Scotland and was active really in the early 20th century. And Lillian May Miller, who was American, actually born in Japan to a missionary parents, and again was active in the early 20th century. And both Bertha Lum and Elizabeth Keith also left written accounts of their visits to Mount Kŭmgang. Mount Kŭmgang was very important in the work of these artists. Another thing that's interesting about these prints is the way that, clearly the artists who produced them came to Mount Kŭmgang on the electric railway. They stayed in the Swiss chalet type hotels and so on. But their representations of the mountains exclude all of those, modernizing, disturbing, as it were, elements and focus on the pure landscape or the pure old temples. And that fits in, I think, with the perceptions of these artists who focused quite a lot on Korea and sometimes also a bit on China. Seeing Korea, I think, as a place where the old folk traditions, which were starting to disappear in Japan itself because of modernization and industrialization, were still preserved. So Korea was, still authentically Eastern, as it were. On the whole, they were very uncritical of Japanese colonialism. I think Elizabeth Keith was perhaps the only one who expressed some reservations about the Japanese colonial project. But Bertha Lum, for example, observed, only recently has Korea become a place of interest to travelers, except as a short route between Japan and China, stopping for a day or so in Seoul and then passing on. Now, however, the Japanese, by making new parts of the country accessible, building roads and opening tombs, are recovering and restoring traces of a time of which there had formerly been almost no records, which I think is quite amusing when you think of the voluminous Korean literature that had been written about a place like Mount Kŭmgang. So Western and Japanese encounters with the mountains involved a sort of interesting mixture of selective memory, forgetting, reimagining. And then when you move forward into the period of the war and after the war, into the period of the division of Korea, those encounters were overlaid by another cloud of selective memory and forgetting. Of course, immediately after the war, Korea was divided and North Korea became relatively inaccessible to outside visitors and tended to be seen as a place of inscrutable mystery. Whereas from the North Korean perspective, Mount Kŭmgang became kind of nationalized. It was part of their territory and something they were very proud of. The Metropolitan Museum's Museum of Art's 2018 exhibition, which I talked about earlier, was a product of collaboration between the Met and the South Korean government and South Korean cultural institutions. So it showed paintings of Mount Kŭmgang by earlier Korean artists and by contemporary South Korean artists, including Shin Jang-sik, the person who painted the very big picture of Mount Kŭmgang that was on the wall behind the leaders' meeting on the 38th parallel. And for artists like Shin Jang-sik, I think Mount Kŭmgang is above all a site of nostalgia, and this is why the Met's the exhibition title included the word nostalgia. There's a sense that these mountains are a very important part, excuse me, of national identity. But that they are inaccessible. You know, they're on the wrong side of the border now. So there is this great sense of loss and longing. But the Met exhibition didn't really have much to say about North Korean representations of the mountains, which are numerous. Mount Kŭmgang appears in all sorts of artistic forms in North Korea. This is just one painting. On the North Korean side of the border, Mount Kŭmgang is not a site of nostalgia or longing, but a sort of site of triumphalism, really. It's an image of the triumph of the Korean people in their liberation struggle against the Japanese colonizers and against the American imperialists in the Korean War. And in fact, Mount Kŭmgang during the Korean War became the site of some ferocious fighting, a fact that isn't very much commemorated in South Korea or the rest of the world, but is very much remembered in North Korea. And very sadly, most of really, I think all the temples in the mountains were destroyed during the war. The North Korean version is that they were destroyed by American bombing, and that's probably largely true, although the North Korean narrative doesn't note the fact that before its final destruction, Chang'an-sa, the temple that I showed you a photo of before, had actually been used by the northern side as a prisoner of war camp. So I think both sides were responsible for the destruction of this very important cultural heritage. A number of the temples have been rebuilt by the North Korean authorities since then. And there are even a few monks in some of the temples. But the horrors of war provided a sort of backdrop which enhanced the drama of the triumph over adversity, which is, you know, presented in North Korean art. And the idea of North Korean art, the sort of ideological demands that are put on North Korean art are that they should be socialist, combine socialism and nationalism. So they often have this quite traditional sort of artistic style that you can see in this picture by one well-known North Korean artist, but they also have to have a propaganda message. And this message appears not just in visual arts, not just in painting, but also in music and in drama and in revolutionary operas. One of the best known of them being this, the song of Kŭmgang-san Mountain, which it's a typical sort of North Korean opera. It's a story of a family torn apart by the war and colonialism, and then war, and then ultimately they're all, you know, reunited. It has a happy ending, and it figures these sonyo, these spiritual beings from Mount Kŭmgang, who rather interestingly appear in the final scene of the opera to sing a song of praise to the great leader Kim Il-sung, who has brought the family back together. Just as early Korean Buddhism identified prominent landscape features with particular Buddhas or bodhisattvas, in North Korean Juche thought, official ideology, natural landscapes have come to be identified with the persons of the leaders and the leaders' family, the Kim family. And Mount Paektu is preeminently associated with the male leaders, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-Un. And Mount Kŭmgang, interestingly, is still seen in terms of the female goddesses, as it were, the female members of the Kim family. So Mount Kŭmgang is particularly associated with the person of Kim Jong-suk, the mother of Kim Jong-il. I'm not quite sure why, I don't think there's any evidence that she had a particularly close association with the mountains, although I'm sure she visited them. But if you go to Mount Kŭmgang, you can see these very big images of her all over the mountain landscape. But also in North Korea and in South Korea, Mount Kŭmgang has retained a place as an embodiment of national identity that transcends the division. And particularly in the early part of the 21st century, it became a powerful symbol of reconciliation between the two Koreas. So with the start of the Sunshine Policy, which was initiated by the former late South Korean President Kim Jong-un, short-term movement of people across the border increased, and Mount Kŭmgang became accessible for a while to South Koreans. It was one of the few places that was quite easily accessible to South Koreans. Tours to Mount Kŭmgang started originally by ship in 2003, but then later overland by bus. And ordinary South Koreans, almost for the first time, had an opportunity to go to the north and experience a little bit of brief stays there. So that's a largish group of South Koreans with their cameras in Mount Kŭmgang in 2008. Meanwhile, the resort, which was built for the tourists by the Hyundai Corporation, also became the site for reunions of families who had been separated by the Korean War and the division of the peninsula. These started in the year 2000, and more than 130,000 Koreans registered for the opportunity to meet family. Sadly, only a very small proportion of them ever got to meet their relatives on the other side of the divide. Only about 17,000 people had the opportunity to meet their lost family. And many of the people who had originally registered to take part in these reunions died while still waiting to meet, brothers, sisters, parents, or others on the other side of the line. And since then, the reunions have ended, and we don't know when or whether they will ever start again. I had the good fortune to visit Mount Kŭmgang twice, once from the southern side in 2008, when you could still just literally get on a tour bus in Seoul and go across to Mount Kŭmgang for a couple of nights and come back again. And then the following year, when I went to the mountains from the North Korean side. When I first went in 2008, it seemed as though, somehow the momentum of reunion was surely unstoppable. There were obvious problems, which were that the visitors from South Korea who went to Mount Kŭmgang were kind of contained within a resort. They could meet North Korean guides and workers within the resort, but they couldn't meet others. They couldn't go out except on very closely sort of controlled guided tours. And the gap between the wealth of the South Koreans and this rather relatively luxurious resort, which you can see at the top left, and the poverty of the villagers immediately around, the one that you can see at the bottom right, for example, was very obvious and extreme. But there was no mistaking the real enthusiasm of Koreans from both sides for these opportunities to meet one another. And it made, the political line that divided them seem particularly bizarre. But when I went to Mount Kŭmgang again the following year from the northern side, the situation had already changed. Not long after I made the first visit to Mount Kŭmgang, a South Korean woman on one of those tours had wandered out of the resort for a walk early in the morning and gone into a controlled zone where she was shot dead by a North Korean security guard. And that created a crisis in North-South relations, which in a sense never really recovered. I mean, it wasn't, obviously the killing itself was not the only thing that caused the crisis, but it was the trigger. The Mount Kŭmgang resort ultimately closed. I think the building has now been destroyed. The flow of visitors from south to north declined. But even at that stage, it seemed as though that might just be a temporary reversal. And, the relationship's gone through ups and downs over time. But in a sense, the moment of heady optimism, which characterized the Sunshine Policy of the beginning of the 21st century, has never really been recaptured. In 2018, as we saw, and I mentioned at the start, the conjunction of a progressive-leaning government in South Korea and Donald Trump's presidency in the United States led to this dramatic meeting with Kim Jong-Un and produced the diplomatic moves that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. But I think really, even at that time, it was fairly clear that this was a piece of political theatre that didn't really have deep diplomatic skills and commitment that would make it an enduring turning point. And particularly, I would say, on the US side, it didn't have the real depth of skill and commitment that was needed to make it something sustainable. Today, the moments of reconciliation obviously have receded again. East Asia has shifted to a more divided and dangerous set of alignments, dominated by tensions between the US and China particularly. But I think that if we look at the region from the perspective of Mount Kŭmgang, it can remind us of the deep cultural and historical ties which bind the region together, and remind us that the political alignments which divide or unite East Asia are always changing over time. And in the long run, they will certainly change again, even though we can't really predict in what way. And art and literature and travel can continue to weave fragile webs of connection, even when politics divide. And I thought I'd like to end up with the words of the pioneering woman traveler, Kim Jong-Un, who I mentioned earlier, this brave young woman who at the age of 14 dressed up as a boy and went off to the mountains. And she wrote in her travel diary some words which seem rather resonant, I think, in the present day. She said, "The land under heavens is enormous, and the time from past to present has been long. The mountains were originally one, but have scattered in 10,000 different shapes. The waters were originally 10,000 different streams, but have eventually joined together in a single current. Without seeing the magnificent mountains and rivers with your own eyes, and without perceiving the gravity of things with your own mind, you will never be able to attain the truth. You will remain perpetually narrow-minded with poor insight. Therefore, the merciful love the mountains, and the wise love the waters." Thank you.